Backdrop, sir, I am very pleased to commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the motion is agreed to. David Clark.
Mr Speaker, this bill is one that Labor will support, albeit within the wider context of concern that this government lacks real vision for making the changes that are needed across the economy to get our economy back on track. This government has the worst economic record of any government in the last 50 years, and here we are debating a bill which makes minor changes across the tax framework. And, Mr Speaker, it will be interesting to see what things come up at Select Committee, because there are some of the rules prescribed in here which could well be questioned, and I'm sure will, by those with an interest. And there are alternative ways of going about skinning the cat of tax avoidance in terms of assets that are privately owned. This bill makes changes that are important in relation to the livestock valuation methods. And switching methods of livestock valuation has provided farmers with an unfair advantage in terms of tax for a very long period of time. Those farmers who followed the rules as they were intended to be used were placed at a competitive disadvantage. The Labor Party supports this change because it is a fair change that makes sure these rules are applied in a fair way. And I understand this bill provides some exceptions, and no doubt that is around tidying it up so that it's a policy that can be implemented for the benefit of our country. Now, there is some rich irony, of course, in the Minister talking about all New Zealanders paying their fair share. Today I have released information which makes it clear that multinationals like Facebook are not paying their fair share in this country. We've seen them paying $5,000 in tax in New Zealand in 2010. It's gone up a little to $14,500 in 2011. When they have 2.2 million users, it seems unbelievable that they paid in 2010 less tax than your average New Zealand labourer. And when we don't make progressive changes to our tax system, and when we don't close loopholes, we end up with a system that is unfair. And that undermines the credibility and the fair functioning of our tax system. This bill could go a long way further to address the big issues in our economy, but it is stuck addressing one or two sensible matters without progressing the bigger picture. So, Mr Speaker, we will be supporting certainly the changes proposed in terms of livestock valuation because they make the system fairer. The changes in respect of mixed-use assets will be, I'm sure, hotly debated at Select Committee. Businesses that use less than 62 days or 62 working days, if the asset is typically used on working days, will be considered a mixed-use asset, and the tax rules applying to that asset will change. And there are other ways of addressing this problem, such as applying rules in a similar way to which the fringe benefit tax rules are applied in respect of cars. And it's a fair question to ask why we're not going down that track, why instead we are creating some complex rules which will be difficult to police. Of course, these mixed-use assets are close to Kiwis' hearts. We know that the home, the boat, the batch and the aircraft, if you're fortunate enough to have these assets, are things that will be looked after and valued both for private use and for public use. And these things are dealt with very directly in this bill. So, I don't want to go too far down the route of exploring whether cabbage boats will be applied to these rules, whether helicopters owned by German billionaires will be captured within these rules, such as the helicopter owned by Kim.com that flew the member for Epsom to and from the .com mansion in John Key's electorate.
Landed beside the giraffe and she then forgot.
Mr Mallard tells me that the helicopter landed beside a giraffe, which Mr Banks must have forgotten. He certainly forgot about the money in the brown envelopes he was handed. All of this sounds a little bit implausible, and one hopes that the government will be able to remember how to apply these laws if it is fortunate enough to pass them through the Select Committee process and to refine them in an appropriate fashion. These issues are sensible to address, but as I said at the outset, Mr Speaker, there are many ways to skin this cat. There are other things that could be done that won't be done, we know, because the IRD's computer systems are ageing. The core first IT system is over 20 years old, and it can no longer handle big changes. And so this government is in the process of backtracking on various changes it's realised it can't make. It's also highly likely that the government would not currently be able to introduce a pro-growth capital gains tax should it see the light and understand the benefit of sending a neutral investment signal to business people rather than one which implies tax avoidance through investment in housing. Mr Speaker, that problem alone probably limits the scope of this bill in a way which is incredibly unfortunate. The current Minister of Revenue has been aware of this problem for all 7 years he's been Minister, and yet he has failed to lay out a credible timeline for fixing the computer system and failed to be transparent about costs and processes. We saw today in the House at question time his refusal to release any information on 80 documents directly relating to the business transformation process that the IRD is undertaking in order to eventually, one hopes, update those IT systems. But we don't know. Mr Key said on Valentine's Day this year, on the 14th of February, that Kiwis need an IT system that works in their IRD. And that's a sensible thing to wish for. I support him in that. He was loving it. He was loving it. I support him in that because every country in the Western world needs a functioning tax system. But we've seen no action since. The government has not announced any changes, has not announced any credible timeline or change program. So instead we're left tinkering with legislation that will not change much, that will plug a little hole here or there, that will debate what the best way to do things is, that might change some of the GST rules, and we've seen, of course, the government doing that before when Mr Key said he wouldn't put up GST to 15% and then, well, we live in a dynamic environment, I think he said. And then next thing you know, it was 15%. And Kiwi families have been struggling ever since because those GST changes hit those families in the middle and on low incomes the hardest. Those who are best off are doing pretty well. We understand 90 of the top 100 earners in New Zealand do not declare tax that is consistent with being on the top tax rate. So although they may have hundreds of millions of dollars, they are not declaring income that is above $70,000. And so those who are very well off carry on as they were without being challenged by a proper functioning tax system. The tax revenue has dropped 4% under this government's watch. That's partly because they have overseen the worst economic growth record of any government in 50 years, and partly because of policy changes they've made, and in small part due to the impact of the GFC. And that is advice coming from their own department, that that is only a small part of that picture. They are mismanaging the economy, Mr Speaker. So, as I come to a conclusion, I want to point out that Labour will support this bill to Select Committee because we can see the benefit in addressing some of these loopholes, but that we think this is a lost opportunity for Kiwis to have a better, fairer tax system, to implement pro-growth tax reform that would include a capital gains tax, that would increase savings through universal KiwiSaver, that would introduce research and development tax credits. We would put in monetary policy changes that would give the Reserve Bank tools to manage the exchange rate in the interests of an export-led recovery. We would also build 100,000 affordable homes, Mr Speaker, over 10 years, and we would be converting the dole into a subsidy for apprentices, because these things would actually grow our economy, unlike the tinkering that we see time after time when bills come before this House in the government's name. This government is out of ideas, out of plans. John Key is disappointing New Zealanders. He's not delivering on the promises he made, and he's out of touch. And it seems that Mr Key is content to see New Zealand decline and continues to oversee the worst economic record of any government in the last 50 years.
I've heard that before. I call the honourable member